Hello, and welcome to the Culture Roundtable, brought to you by Culture and Sports, where culture is critical to long-term success. For the past 2 years, Culture and Sports has been educating and influencing organizations, teams, coaches, staff, and even athletes about the importance of culture and leadership in sports, as it greatly impacts organizational success, team and athlete performance, and the short and long-term mental, physical, and emotional health of athletes. Leadership organizational culture adversely or positively have a cost and impact to every organization's bottom line, not only for fans in the stands, concession sales, and merchandise sales, but broadcasting, advertising, and endorsement deals. We believe in our mantra of culture is critical for long-term success and strive to promote this every day. I'm your host, Jeremy Piasecki, and I would like to introduce you to our Culture Roundtable. The purpose of this webinar is to discuss lessons learned from COVID-19 and discuss how people lead others through risks, uncertainty, and persistent sudden change, and how the pandemic informs future strategies. I would like to now introduce you to a special group of panelists. Heather Pavlik, she's the head coach of women's volleyball at Waniata College, where they have won 41 consecutive conference championships and 3 national championships. Next, we have Maureen, who also goes by Mo Cooper, the Director of Commonwealth at Campus Athletics at Penn State University. And she has over 30 years of experience working in intercollegiate athletics and higher education. Next, we have is Professor Bob Bolin. He's a Seton Hall Law Professor and counsel at Shoemaker Law Firm, and he recently served as the Athletics Integrity Officer at Penn State University. And we have Dr. Natalie Hernandez de Palma. She's the Senior Director at Penn State Counseling and Psychological Services, and she was also the inaugural member of the Big Ten Mental Health Cabinet. We also have Christina Diaz, who's the Assistant Athletic Director for Development and Enrichment at Penn State University Athletics, and she was a 4-year varsity letter winner in volleyball at the University of Florida. And finally, I would like to introduce you to today's moderator, Dr. Carl Olson. He's a retired Army Lieutenant Colonel, former director of West Point Center for Enhanced Performance, and the former Penn State Assistant Athletic Director for Performance Psychology.
Thanks, Jeremy. I'd like to start this discussion with setting a little bit of a context. We're looking at leading through, especially the early days in the shutdown from the COVID-19 pandemic, an unprecedented time in our lives where we every day dealt with ambiguity, uncertainty, sudden change, and we had relationships tested, we had cultures tested, and it was because none of us had lived through it before, we couldn't just turn to our mentor and say like, hey, when you navigated a pandemic, how did you do it? Like there was no playbook for this. So a lot of adaptive thinking, a lot of creative leadership, and the panel that we have today exemplifies all of that. So we're going to go through a couple of different lessons learned here and realize that, and hopefully one of the messages that'll come out of this is, yes, we were all tested in really unique and unprecedented ways, and a bunch of these panelists here and others who are colleagues with them found ways to not only survive, but also thrive. And so I'd like to start the discussions with our leadoff batter here, Christina Diaz. And I've referred to you before as a Swiss Army knife of the athletic department because you've done so many different things and have been involved in so many different ways. Also, right before the shutdown, you had just become the special assistant to the vice president of intercollegiate athletics at Penn State. So right at the right hand of Sandy Barber for the whole journey through that pandemic. So let's start with you. And what are some of the, what's your golden nugget that you took away from that experience?
Thanks, Carl. Hello, everyone. I'm excited. This communication is my favorite subject of all time, which is also fun because I am nowhere near a expert at it and continue to learn from it. What I will also say is my golden nugget is pulled from a book suggestion from Carlson, which was Call Sign Chaos, written by General Jim Mattis, also known as Mad Dog. I'm a big nickname person, so Mad Dog definitely sticks out for me. But what I would start with there is he suggests utilizing 3 things. What do I know? who needs to know it, and have I told them? And especially in this time frame during COVID, that was always going to be the basis of what communication I needed to express. In my role as on the executive staff, serving as a special assistant with Sandy, with our athletic director, my role was to manage all communication to her, from her, throughout the department. And so that was challenging at times, especially knowing primary goal is to continue our messaging for our goals and our mission. And for those of you that have worked in athletics, that mission and goal, while it should stay the same, every day is challenged. That can be changed yearly, it can be changed monthly, it can be changed daily, weekly, hourly, second by second, depending on what's going on. So my job was to know exactly what our mission was, what was Sandy's mission that day, or that week, or that month, and ensuring that what our actions were, we were communicating that both on a written message, what we were doing verbally, our actions, items we may be supporting, groups that we might be getting with third parties, etc. So communication wasn't just a face-to-face component. It definitely branched out to several different avenues that we could take. So the other piece that I would comment on in this communication thing would be getting out of the office. So while I felt very much needing to be the right hand physically for this executive role, I would get more information, find out things that I would have never found out if I stayed in my office. So I would get connected with people that may have never felt comfortable coming to that office to share some information, or people that I could never get to because of the physical office location of campus, needing to get across campus, going to practice, going to a competition, stopping by a campus event, a guest speaker, whatever that might be, so that I'm getting a face-to-face opportunity to express that. Little challenging in COVID, and we were definitely challenged in this virtual space. Now we have that limitation lifted off, and that shouldn't change where we can get in front of people. And even then, ensuring that we have that Zoom opportunity, the virtual opportunity to continue to have that communication. So really circling back to the golden nugget of what do I know, who needs to know it, and have I told them? Utilizing that as the basis for communication in a pandemic, hopefully not one for the future, but in a pandemic or not.
Awesome. Thanks for getting us started on that. And I love General Mattis quote anytime. So, Bob, you served in a strategic position that is unique of all positions at Penn State. And it gave you a lens on really things that were going really well in spite of the pandemic, and things that were really challenging, and people having to navigate all of the interpersonal friction that can happen in a big place, while also dealing with the stress of the shutdown and the uncertainties and everything. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Carl, I think this is a great comment, because as athletic integrity officer, I was sort of looking ahead, and I was seeing an athletic department of coaches and people and leaders, from Christina to you to Mo to the coaches and everybody around, who were pulling together and really managing to deal with the most difficult of circumstances and most changeable of environments. If I were to talk about the people who were steering the ship, it was really a story of great success. Where I saw it kind of break down, and where I saw it as particularly as the pandemic lingered and had fits and starts, and then particularly as normalcy sort of came back, or a new normal came back with fits and starts, we saw that disruption led to, rather than success and sort of resilience and a sense of thriving on the part of athletes, their parents, others in the community, the disruption allowed people to fill in a lot of narratives that were involved anger, perception, and frustration. So if you were concerned and tolerable before, the pandemic in some cases made people really aggressively upset over what had not gone right, and allowed them to stew over that period of time. So I feel like the greatest effects that we've had, maybe the politicization of the pandemic, and I don't really want to talk about politics at all, but it allowed people not to feel that they'd been successful, and survive something really terrible with great care, but it allowed them to think about what they missed and what they'd lost and what they weren't getting. And I feel like that was a big issue. And at least from my assessment, I thought coaches managed it very well on almost every level. I feel as if athletes, and particularly parents whose life is sometimes measured by their children's athletic success, were in some ways the most displaced in this relationship. So I think there were some important lessons for us to learn, and maybe touch on today as we come out of that this was a good time for people, not a terrible time, and that the comeback wouldn't all be in a day.
You know, just on that point too, Bob, I remember distinctly telling colleagues around the table, around the virtual table, and management team that we were going to find a way to survive this. And it was the first time in my lifetime that I could think of that the entire world was trying to solve the same problem. And it was a different way of looking at the situation. Instead of the sky is falling, so look how many resources are being leveraged. And you're right, there's a pretty cool story in there. So appreciate your perspective.
I'll add one more thing, and just in response that I'm working with a coach right now in a contract situation at another institution, where he tells me that his team, a major sports team at the school, couldn't hold a practice for 7 months. And that was it was a 1 game below 500 season for him. And now he's asking 4 years later or 3 years later, how are you evaluating me on a year that I had no practices for 7 months with my team, and we still showed up and played and did all this? So I do think that it also has an evaluative component, particularly for athletic leaders, that we probably want to also throw out there.
That's great. And fortunately, in a short while here, we're going to hear from a legendary coach who was on the ground throughout all this stuff. Before we get there, I want to switch over to Natalie for a couple of moments. And Natalie, you and I had worked together pretty closely in some unique ways, especially right before the shutdown and then through it. At the time, you were the interim director of counseling and psychological services, and also our first representative to the Big Ten Mental Health and Wellness Cabinet, and layered into all of what you were seeing as the interim director and then eventually senior director. We also had what was going on in society that has never gone away, but potentially was exacerbated during this time. And some of your work that contributed in the diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging space was so influential as well. So I could go on for days about what you did as a leader in this. I'd like to hear from you what you saw.
Thanks, Carl. I think the 3 biggest takeaways for me from COVID were around inclusivity and boundaries and equifinality. So I think inclusivity came online very quickly when we had to pivot overnight, train the entire staff on how to do teletherapy, train them on Zoom etiquette, make sure that we had sort of a baseline to be able to serve our students. And we really did not want to miss a beat. And so what I think the unintended consequence, the positive outcome there, is that we're able to serve more students now who may have different kinds of needs. So the student who's extraordinarily socially isolated, agoraphobic, can't leave their room, is now able to have access to care that perhaps we weren't able to offer them prior to the pandemic. We have moved our whole system to a permanent hybrid model. That is wonderful. That's wonderful for students that have accessibility needs, and just expanding the idea of care. So I think that inclusivity benefited not just our students, but also our staff. We were seeing what it was like for each of our staff to be working from home and needing to support all of their important people. And that made us a more inclusive culture, I think, as a result of COVID. So that's been a wonderful takeaway, I think, of resulting in more inclusivity. Boundaries have always been important. It's something that I think we all talk about. One of the pieces that I've taken away from COVID has been the really critical difference between cognitive empathy and emotional empathy. So cognitive empathy, you might think of as something like rational compassion. It's if someone's suffering and they're standing on one side of like a fence, and you can go over and talk with them. You might even reach over and you know, kind of offer them some care, but you never jump onto their side of what their lived experience is. We have to sort of stay firmly grounded in our role. And I think what I noticed that really came home for me in COVID was the importance of doing that so that we could keep our cups as full as possible, to keep drawing from them, because the work did not end, and it hasn't. I would like to think we're in a very post-pandemic world, and yet we're not. And I think, Carl, you gave me a good lesson right in the middle of COVID, and I forget what the resource was, but it was, I think, a writing by someone who'd had an experience as a prisoner of war. And the fact that one of the things that led to the most suffering for them was thinking, when it gets back to normal, if I'm home by this holiday, everything will be okay. And I think, like any grief experience, what we learned in COVID is that this is not a detour. We are not going to go over here, fix something, and then come back and everything's going to be the way it was. This is our life now. And that has been a really critical takeaway, and I think has led to some wonderful conversations around how we can be really empathic, but also appropriately boundary. That's Brene Brown's work. That's not mine, but the most boundary people in the world are the most compassionate. That's what all of her empathy research shows. And that was an important finding for me to tell our staff about. And I think equifinality is my last takeaway. And for us, that means that you sort of start here, you want to be here, and there's about a million ways to get from here to there. And it's not up to us to judge how someone gets to their next right step, but we want to accompany them. And so as a leader, I think a lot about being a coxswain in my undergraduate experience, and how as a leader, I think often you're the only person that can see the direction where you're heading, and your whole team is working tirelessly. And just like Christina shared, we're trying to say, hey, the weather's doing this, or look out over here, and really being communicative in an ongoing way, and knowing that things are going to keep changing. So those are my biggest takeaways.
Awesome. I can't wait for when we get into the crosstalk here, because you think about the over communication necessity in some of that there, and the perspective taking and so forth. And the model that you're referring to, Natalie, was Jim Collins had coined the term that when he had interviewed Admiral Stockdale, who was the one that had been in the POW camp for so many years in isolation. And he coined the term the Stockdale Paradox, because it was accept the brutal reality of the situation and then be relentless in your belief that you will persevere, but it was never on a timeline. And that fit one of our early conversations in 2020, that fit so well with the acceptance commitment model. And that which came in handy over and over again. And we had a lot of coaches that latched onto it. So I'm glad that you brought that up today. So now we're going to shift gears a little bit to Penn State is a massive organization, right? People think about Penn State, they think about University Park, the main campus, the flagship. Now we've got Mo Cooper joining us, who has an incredible span of responsibility across all of the athletic departments, across the entire Commonwealth campus system at Penn State, and obviously trying to lead that kind of a disparate organization that's both geographically separated and very much local culture influenced. What did you see at the top of that?
So yeah, thanks, Carl. I'm super happy to be here, and I'm probably going to mirror some of the things that have been said, about biggest lessons learned. Obviously, through the pandemic, we learned that we didn't have a crisis management plan established for intercollegiate athletic programs throughout the Commonwealth. So like Carl said, I work with the Penn State Commonwealth campus athletic programs. There's 19 of them. They all work autonomously. They have their own athletic directors, staff, coaches. I had felt like we probably did a really good job of sharing information and communicating prior to the pandemic. The pandemic then hits, and our campus communities, those athletic directors or the campus communities, mirrored sort of what was happening globally. You had populations of people that didn't think the pandemic was a big deal. You had some that felt like it was the end of the world coming from an athletic perspective. You had, people who did not believe that athletes should be competing, that all competition should be shut down. That then you had other populations who felt like campus athletic programs or athletics they must continue. And it was all, sort of regionally based, sort of to Bob's point earlier. And I certainly don't want to get into the political space of the pandemic, but the position that it was putting our athletic directors in was they were paralyzed to communicate with the student athletes, coaches, student athlete families, because they didn't want to say the wrong thing. They didn't want to, they did not know what was the best thing to do. So what we did as a sort of conference office, and I feel like that's how we operate really, is we had to become the mouthpiece for our campus athletic programs. We had to get with the experts and share that information across the Commonwealth. So we're not connected with the Division I program. While Christina and the athletic trainers and the doctors were good resources and would answer questions, we didn't have the financial support that the Division I program had. We didn't have the Big Ten's task force on, I can't now remember the name of it, but the task force for infectious disease. So we needed to lean on, we needed to identify what is our credible resource. And so we leaned on the NCAA. And we decided collectively as a group that we were going to operate exactly how the NCAA was, in accordance with the NCAA's guidance, because we knew that that was a reliable resource. They had, incredibly intelligent doctors, physicians, government individuals that were participating on the NCAA's COVID-19 medical resource team. And so we wanted to make sure that our campus programs were in line with what was the national landscape. And then it was our responsibility to communicate that to the athletic directors, to the coaches, to the student athletes, because obviously the safety of our student athletes was our, first priority. But sort of way secondarily is we didn't want to be losing student athletes. We didn't want student athletes to leave Penn State because we were not in line with what the national landscape was with regard to training, practices, competitions. So, so we felt like, again, our best opportunity was to follow the NCAA's guidance and their recommendations. So again, the communication, what we had to do is we developed very regular meetings with our athletic directors. We met twice a week, and the goal in those meetings was to provide any updates on state, local, national, federal, in NCAA guidance to make sure we had the most up-to-date information. We listened to what was happening on the, within the campus communities. And we tried to sort of, we supported them and what was supported them sort of in an effort to reduce sort of the distress that they were feeling. I think that was a really important position that my office was in. And then lastly, we had to advocate, on behalf of our campus communities. We had to go to the university's administration and say, look, in order for us to be sort of in line with the national landscape of intercollegiate athletics, we need money. We need some money to test. We need some money to ensure the safety of our student athletes, our coaches, our spectators. And in order for us to be able to continue, you need to be able to do that. And I think that we did that. We effectively did that because we were able to resume practice and competition at the exact same level as like institutions within our region. I feel like, again, the biggest lesson was to over communicate. And, Christina said it best. If we were able to give our athletic directors the tools that they needed to be able to effectively communicate with the upset parent and the upset student athlete, then it was a win for us.
On that communication point, before I switch to Heather, it's something that I remember popping up pretty frequently when I was around people that were doing their best to communicate, is that the next level down, and in this case, it was coaches, were experiencing some stress and frustration with how come the narrative's changing every day. Well, the reality of the situation was that it was persistent change and ambiguity and uncertainty driving everything. And so having a little bit of patience and demonstrating some grace with what would otherwise be frustrating situations seemed to go a long way. And it also helped by being able to say, now, okay, coach, you're frustrated at the sudden change from administration or above. Remember, your athletes are going through that same kind of emotional whiplash too. So there's this up and down and sideways in all kinds of different directions where it was never going to be comfortable. And that had to be okay, because we just needed to keep moving forward. And what's the next thing we know, and who else needs to know, and make sure that we're telling them, et cetera. So let's move into the tactical leader on the ground. All right. So we've got Heather Pavlik here, who has been and continues to be a legendary women's volleyball coach at Juniata. You're in the spring preparing for your fall season, and all of a sudden your world goes sideways. And I would fast forward to, hopefully this isn't stealing your thunder, but you come out of the pandemic and win a national championship, which is like not a little thing. So pretty incredible. What'd you learn and how'd you do it?
It was interesting because with our schedule, we actually were not training at all prior to spring break. We were going to do all of that after spring break. So what we were allowed to be doing at that time was to have maybe a once a week leadership meeting. And funny enough, the topic during those leadership meetings was controlling the controllables. So that's what we sent them home from spring break with. Of course, everything happened over spring break. We get an extended spring break. And once we came out of it, realized we weren't going to be coming back to campus. So the first Zoom that we had with our team was, okay, we're not coming back from spring break. You're going to be at home doing classes. This will be the ultimate test of what we just talked about. It will be the ultimate test of controlling the controllables and not allowing the things that you cannot control to derail you, to stress you out horribly, or to put you into a negative headspace. I myself thought, boy, this is going to be the biggest test for me. I am going to have to live what I just talked with them about, because as coaches, we really do like to have a lot of control of things. We're used to planning. We're used to having an idea of what we're going to do when we go into it. And we had no idea what was going to happen. So kind of sitting down here with my staff, it's funny, we went back and we were talking the other day about this, how first thing we did was hop onto a Zoom altogether, which we had never done before, and tell our players, we don't know. We don't know what's going to happen. And that's the honest to goodness truth. What we do know is we will find a way to connect with you. We will find a way to train you, even if it's over Zoom, and do the best with this we possibly can and try to keep us together as a group. Behind closed doors as a staff, there were a lot of people around us. The sky was falling, for a lot of people. And we said, we just can't be those people. We have to make sure that, what can we control here? Well, we decided what we can control was getting onto Zoom each week with each player, going through video, doing the things we were allowed to do because we were supposed to be training, and helping them continue to move forward and to give them purpose, to give them something to look forward to every week. As well as a staff, we can recruit like crazy. It might not look like it looked previous, but we can still recruit like crazy. I got this background I have with me today. I learned how to use Zoom efficiently. And we did a lot of things through Zoom through the summer. The hard part for us is we never did have a 2020 season. It was canceled. I will say that Juniata did a really nice job of providing opportunities for training. We trained all through the fall. We trained all through the spring of 21, wearing masks and practices with masks for everybody, and lots of other things that we were doing to try to make it safe. But they did provide that opportunity. And I think for me, that also kind of, I've been coaching since I was 23. You get into a groove, and maybe sometimes you could call it a rut. It reminded me why I'm doing what I'm doing. There was nothing to win. There were no championships. But I knew every day when I went into the gym, those people needed me. They needed each other, and they needed the opportunity to have some normalcy, to do something they love that is normal. For me, it was kind of a renewed passion. It was almost like having to take a little sabbatical from the competition part of it. And for me, at that point in my career, that was very, very healthy. That has stuck with me. I think that's the thing I've retained. I think my team has retained, and our players have retained, the idea that there will be lots of things you can't control. And I think that worked through the 21 season, where we had a really nice finish, finished up losing in a 5-game match in the semifinal, the national semifinal. This year, obviously, we broke through and won the national championship. And every one of the athletes we had on this team, other than the freshmen, were here and had to go through some portion of the pandemic here. The 2020s were freshmen that year. They didn't get to compete. They were just practicing. And they hung in through it, which says a lot about them. The 21s were recruited during all of that. So what we decided to do with recruiting is we took it all outside. We had people come for visits, and Juniata let us do it. And we walked them all around campus. I gave tours because no one up in enrollment was giving tours. So we gave personal tours. I became great. I'm a great tour guide now. I gave tours. My associate head coach, Casey, gave tours. We did them together, and we sat outside and talked to families, sometimes under a little awning in the pouring rain, but we found a way to do it. And I think that turned into a really great class of sophomores that we have now. And they committed to this place with still some uncertainty, not knowing what was going to happen. And then, of course, we had, the people we had as freshmen this year were being, playing their last year, being recruited through all of this. So there were different ways we kind of dealt with them, but we kept using Zoom. We kept using Zoom to connect with players and their families in order to have conversations that maybe we wouldn't have done prior. We figured it was something we could do that would add to the experience. It would allow them to get face-to-face with us, even if they couldn't come to campus. And we've continued that. So for players from further away, you can do some of those kind of things. So we've kind of retained the idea that you have to make the best of whatever the situation is. And you may not like it, but you have to find a way to find some good in it. And you have to be honest with people about what the situation is, but you got to be hopeful too. And you have to show them that you're hopeful. And I think that's kind of what I've taken away from this whole experience. And I think it's what our group has taken away from it as well.
So I'm going to give you all a chance to pause and think about some questions, because Heather's a hard act to follow, and I've seen that before. So in a moment or two, I'll open this up as an open forum, so the panelists can ask questions of each other and go a little bit further. But there's one theme that I want to share, because it jumped out from each of you in different ways, and it has to do with the relationship side of things and putting some things in place long before you need it. And I remember distinctly in the summer of 2019, before all this happened, I was co-presenting in a management team retreat I was a retired Army infantry officer. The other guy was an active duty Navy SEAL. We had never met, and a question was asked about what's the single most important ingredient in leadership, and we both simultaneously said relationships. Like it was almost synchronized, except for neither one of us knew we were going to say it, and it happened spontaneously. We didn't even look at each other, and the whole room just kind of looked at us for a moment. It's like, yeah, I know stereotypically we're knuckle dragon warfighters, and we're telling you relationships matter. And the thing that I noticed in connecting with colleagues across the country via Zoom that are in different spaces, whether it's university athletics or professional athletics or business or whatever, is the folks that had invested time in the relationships long before they quote unquote needed it, were able to eventually thrive. And the ones that tried to build the relationships while the stress response had already kicked in for everybody had a very, very difficult time, at least initially, trying to build those bridges. So when we talk about some things that we learned coming out of it, and I heard each of you in different ways say, we need to not go backwards on this, keep leveraging what we learned and keep improving and evolving. I think those relationships that turned out to be critical glue to everything, like that's one of those things that we maybe put an exclamation point on, and making sure that it's not the thing that we do when we have time, but rather the thing we do because we can't afford not to. So with that little monologue, let me open up the room here. I also have a question sitting aside just in case, but I would love to hear what you all have for each other now.
I'm never at a loss for words, so I probably should fill in that blank. Heather, my God, what you said prompted such an incredible response from me in this context. But were there colleagues, fellow coaches, that weren't able to find that mindset? And were there any nuggets or pearls that you could offer to them to kind of help them see through this and come out the other side?
I certainly think I think we all struggled, but I think there were some who struggled more than others. And we also have a lot of young coaches here. And so when you're faced with something like this and you're just worrying about figuring out how to be a head coach, it adds a lot of stress. And so I think there were lots of conversations that happened in our department. And interestingly enough, although we were separated because we were really supposed to be staying in our offices as much as possible, because it's a small department, we didn't necessarily have all of the excess staff to do some of the things that we were going to need to do because of COVID. So for instance, myself and all the other coaches here were doing things like standing up in the entryway with our little gun, our little thermometer, right? Taking temperatures. So that really happened. And so we were checking our colleagues in during the day to make sure, temperature is good, you can go in. And I think a lot of conversations happened there. And I think that's where a lot of the encouragement happened as well, because they're laughing at you taking their temperature, right? Who thought we'd be in this place? But it was also a bonding thing because we were all doing it. No one was better than anyone else. Everyone had to do these kind of things to make sure that we were successful and safe. We were helping each other use a hydrostatic sprayer to clean the floor in between practices. And I just think there were a lot of opportunities for encouragement, for conversations, for maybe coaches who have been in it a little longer, who seem to be managing it a little bit better, to help their colleagues. So I definitely think that happened.
I've got a question for the group, and Heather's making me think of it as well, but I lean on Carl here because my question would be to prep all of you, because I would love to hear your response, is what your first natural go-to answer is when you're faced with a challenge. So for example, and I hold on to this because I know I tend to probably be like, I don't think so. But Carl's answer is whenever, I feel like any type of challenge, no matter what type of question you face him with, which is probably why he was an Army Ranger, but was okay. And just moving on to the next thing. It's a shrug of shoulders of, sure, let's try it. Seeing it more as an opportunity than it is as a challenge. So would love to hear from each of you. And Heather, I would think you're on the jump bandwagon of, okay, I can't have on-campus recruiting. Okay, we'll go outside and we'll battle the rain, or I can host practices by watching film on it. So you're accepting the challenge and finding ways of opportunities around it. What would be your first response, and then how do you change that if it's not an okay?
So I can jump in real quick. My sort of entree into intercollegiate athletics, I started in athletic compliance. So I worked in athletic compliance at some amazing places, the Atlantic Coast Conference, Wake Forest, the University of Miami. And so I feel like I was really young when I first got the job. So my immediate answer to everything was no. And to speak to sort of what Carl talked about a little bit earlier is that really prohibited me from establishing relationships with coaches, really, really important relationships with coaches that were necessary to function. And so I learned pretty quickly that I needed to come up with, what was my initial reaction going to be? So I changed it to a challenging question, to a challenging situation. So I changed it from no to, all right, let's sort of walk through exactly what it is that you're asking, what you're wanting, and what's the outcome, because I needed to know what the outcome, what the hopeful outcome was, to sort of help us, sort of plan how we were going to get there. So very often, I mean, the answer was probably no, but it was always followed up with, you can't do that, but I can get you close. We can get you close to it because I knew what your outcome was. And I knew, while we're not going to get exactly what you want, we're going to get you as close as possible as we possibly can. And I do feel like that, again, that helped with the relationships because those people knew that you really were trying to do everything in your power to provide them opportunities to be successful. So I think that's all anybody could ask for. And that was definitely translated through the pandemic. The initial answer a lot of times was no, we can't do that. But, I know over at Juniata, they're doing this. So why don't we try this? And why don't we, so there was a lot of the sharing of information. So, I mean, I have taken, that direct no, immediate response no out of my sort of vocabulary and, ask a lot more questions to hopefully get to it be in a helpful position.
I really like that, Mo. I train our staff a lot on the rules of improv, and that when someone suggests something, you say yes and, like, yes, and we would like to accomplish this. So I really abide by that. I think two quotes kind of help us get through these types of times. One is some days you win and some days you learn. And so that would be sort of our reflexive at the end of every day, like, boy, are we learning a lot. This has been a week of learning, as opposed to feeling like we're winning much. I also put a reminder on my phone that says, throw me to the wolves and I end up leading the pack. And I really try and say that to the staff a lot, that there are moments where you just feel like, I think Mo used the word that a lot of people froze in the middle of this. And I think we have to honor the sort of involuntary crisis response that is like fight, flight, freeze, fawn, flock. Like, we all do these things. And to sort of move through it, I think that's why I like what Heather was sharing about even taking people on tours around campus, is that walking, doing anything that kind of has you doing this motion where your eyes are sweeping back and forth, is actually a really good response to kind of that type of emergency experience that your body has. And so allowing your mind to then get a little bit more free, it lets you access some of these more action helpful responses. So I would say those really helped.
Heather and Bob, anything to add? That I want to hear all of them. So, because it just keeps getting better and better.
To be really honest, as a young coach, I was probably like, oh, okay, what do we do with this? But I think as I have matured and done this a little bit longer, whether it's within athletics or whether it's in your personal life, whatever it might be, I go back to kind of practice what you preach. Talk to the players all the time about the idea that when you're made uncomfortable, there are moments and opportunities for growth. And it might not be what you think it's going to be, but when you look back on it, you think, wow, that was really good for me to have to go through. It might not have felt great at the time. And maybe I try to take that perspective a little bit. I'd like to attribute some of my growth in that area to who I actually am married to, because he might be the best. And he's kind of calmed me down over the years. And so now I think my response is much more, okay, I'm listening. All right, how can we do this?
My mind goes to some of the other stakeholders who aren't always in the room in this moment. And I think that's the universality of parents of athletes, who I don't think under most circumstances were getting the same messages, were allowed to be in the same place psychologically as their student athletes were. And then I think that message then reflected back onto the student athletes, or the athletes in many cases, that the parents were unnerved and disrupted and concerned and worried about their young people. And as the young people came back to play under altered circumstances, potentially living in bubbles, potentially training under different circumstances, that disruption became almost a something that rose up and couldn't be quelled in some cases. And I think it was important, and Carl will talk to this a little bit too. If the coach and the communication was clear, and that the frustration was to be seen as a benefit, even at the long run, a chance for growth, as Natalie said today, and a lot of growing today days, I think they came through it better than if the coach got torqued around on that one. So it was a consistency of messaging and a way of trying to make people look at things step by step, because they couldn't change their world in that way. So I guess I'm thinking a lot in my job as an athletic integrity officer, really focused on the people who are stakeholders to coaches, athletes, and their parents, and how that has reacted. And I'll also even take it in a little bit more modern context, and not as COVID, but right out of COVID, we went into NIL, and not that is a job for coaches, but it is now a polarity. It's like a fact of gravitational pull and influence. But there's so much misunderstanding about NIL, so much demand that it be met immediately, and not a lot of desire to learn about it. I almost think that's an outcome of a COVID mindset, that I need things to be under control immediately. And when they're not, I have to create that narrative. So I think it shows up in a lot of places, and it's very difficult. And I'll be interested, and maybe this is one to throw out there, for people that have left the coaching and athletic environment because of COVID. Now, I don't know if they'd left because of COVID, or they just aged exponentially in those years and don't want to face it again. But maybe that's another thing to think about, the stresses that this created on people who are leaving, and it's being publicized.
As we saw several colleagues that all of us have known in different ways move on, and for a host of different reasons. But one of the things that was central to it was going through a pandemic that you never could anticipate, got people's attention, and realized that there are certain things are critical, other things are just urgent. And sometimes the urgent isn't really important. It just seems to be. And going back and refining yourself in your own values and what is most important. And so we saw a lot of those kind of decision making. Something else we saw here a couple of minutes ago, and you can see why I call Christina the Swiss Army knife. Like, she's got this way of connecting to everything, listening really carefully, and then formulating a question that the whole group wants to jump all over. So I think we found a future moderator, maybe. No? I'm aware that we are closing in on the end, and I hate to ask a question that could probably go on for days, but I'm going to do it anyway. And just as a primer, I've heard from each of you about things that you've learned and don't want to go back on, and so forth. There's a term I was very familiar with before I ever came to athletics called crisis action plan. And I found that it was not universally understood as a concept, and there weren't a lot of plans in place. And I actually had pushed back on the term plan as we were doing a return to sport plan, return to campus plan, and asked people to consider strategy instead, because a plan suggests that it's pretty fixed, and if you just run the play, it's going to go fine. And strategy is this much bigger piece that includes a philosophy and some guideposts on how you make decisions. Did any of you interact with people that were building such concepts, plans, and strategies that where the thought process could be useful in the future for some other unexpected event?
I'm a part of a group that's doing that work in emergency management. So I don't know if that's what you mean, Carl, but we're doing sort of what happens if there's a catastrophic event, and then how does the university respond accordingly. But I think you're exactly right that thinking about it as strategies and sort of with a lot of flexibility is critical. And I don't know if there's lessons learned, though, that would be helpful to share in this context, but I can just relate.
Yeah, it's more of a question just to get people thinking. And I saw Bob on mute, so I'll shut up real quick, but it may be something that would be worth a future conversation in a more detailed way, because there's lots of different types of strategies for different types of situations, but there's also some fundamental similarities in how you approach a strategy. Bob?
I may have unmuted accidentally, but I think it's a great point. That I think that we have to always focus on, and I think Heather pointed to it, we have to focus on having a plan, implementing the plan, and dealing with the imperfections of that plan as we go. And I think about it is that, you know, I taught at Penn State in the exact same time we went remote. And I don't feel like my classes lost a whole lot by being remote. They managed that. I used to have awards in my class for best pajamas or best appearance of a family pet to keep their cameras on. And I think to some degree that when we take disruptions in stride and see them as opportunities, they really do pay off. I recently just had to argue a motion in federal court, and I had to learn how the electronic filing system works. If you're a certain age, these things can be difficult, because the last time I filed papers in a federal court, I actually took them to the clerk and handed them to them. Now you don't do any of that, but it was remarkable to go through that process and learn. And while I grumped about it a little bit, and I was nervous about it, I think it was a great opportunity for me to kind of regrow skills and to be modernized. And I think that's one of the other things is we all lost some time in this crisis. How do we keep our skills moving forward and fresh during that period of time?
So, Carl, to answer the question sort of directly, you know, are any of us doing anything sort of moving forward or taking these emergency or return to play plans, return to operation plans, and doing anything moving forward with them? We are collectively as a Commonwealth athletic system. You know, we had 10 different editions of the return to athletic operations. And so we called it operations, not plan, which I am now stealing strategy, because moving forward, I want to use strategy, because I think the implication is a positive one, that, you know, that a campus will have an opportunity to sort of personalize based on their facilities. But what we're doing is we're creating a template for an emergency action program for each campus athletic facility and operation. And then utilizing what we created during the pandemic, we're creating that template so we've got a uniform approach across the Commonwealth that emergency, that EHS has been a part of reviewing, because prior to the pandemic, everybody sort of had their own thing, and it was not uniform. And we feel like there's a benefit to it, to have sort of a standard template and to allow for minor sort of personalizations based on facilities or staffing or those types of things. But it has definitely allowed us to utilize that sort of crisis management strategy approach moving forward in the operation of our programs.
I love that concept of a template, because there isn't a one size fits all in terms of action plan, because situations change. But a template does give you something to build off of. And I remember distinctly, we were very fortunate at Penn State in the athletic department at the time. We had a sport performance team. Natalie and I served on that together, along with the heads of all of the other departments that really touched the athletes, athletic training, you know, strength and conditioning, sports medicine, et cetera. The artist formerly known as Welfare and Development, what Christina leads now. All of those around the table on an every other week basis, so that we had the familiarity, we understood what each other did and who we could pull on. And that group ended up building a lot of the return to fill in the blank strategies. And I do remember, this is my last comment, Jeremy, and I'll kick it back to you just as a heads up. I paraphrased General Eisenhower in one of these early meetings, and I said, when he, obviously General of the Army, responsible for the Normandy invasion, et cetera. And he had said, plans are largely useless, but the planning process is essential, because you learn so much as you go through a planning process that gives you things to pull on when it's obvious your plan is not going to survive first contact. So it's just something to think about. And when the planning is in reaction versus proactive, you get two very different responses. Jeremy, back to you.
No, this was an amazing discussion about leadership and culture and its impact on organizations, teams, and athletes. And I know some people probably struggle with, well, how does leadership and organizational culture, come in on this? And us as leaders and us, influencing the organizational culture and leading the organizational culture, it's extremely important about how much we communicate or over communicate, which was said earlier, and be open to ideas of how to make things better and to adjust to change. And I'm sure Natalie could talk for hours or days, just how difficult it is for humans as individuals and as groups to change, and to even think about that change. And so, that's why it's really important. And that's why, this does fall under the leadership and organizational culture realms. I would like to thank each of you seriously for your incredible thoughts and contributions to the Culture Roundtable. And I would actually like to take the time to also thank all the attendees for your desire to be better leaders and to have better culture in your organizations. If you'd like to learn more about culture and sports, our different programs, or the Culture Roundtable, please visit us at cultureandsports.com. Have a great day.